It was a bright afternoon at the bustling international airport, where the sight of security officers guiding passengers and ensuring safety was as routine as the hum of jet engines. Among the crowd, a tall man in a crisp, dark blue uniform walked with quiet confidence. His Air Force insignias gleamed under the terminal lights, a silent testament to years of service and sacrifice. Yet, as he approached the security checkpoint, he could feel eyes on him, watching, judging. "Step aside for further screening," barked a voice, cutting through the general noise of the terminal. The man turned to see a stern-faced security officer gesturing toward a secondary inspection area. Passengers glanced at him, some curious, others indifferent. He followed the direction without a word, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Empty your pockets," the officer ordered, his tone carrying a sharp edge. The pilot complied, carefully placing his wallet, keys, and other items into the tray. But something about the officer's gaze felt off. It wasn't just the routine scrutiny of a security check. It was something more invasive, more personal. "Is there a problem?" the pilot finally asked, his voice steady but laced with a hint of frustration. "Just doing my job," the officer shot back, but the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth betrayed a different story. The tension in the air was palpable. The pilot, a decorated member of the United States Air Force, had faced challenges before, on missions, in training, and even in his daily life. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home, where he should have been met with respect, not suspicion. As the interaction escalated, bystanders began to gather, their whispers filling the space. Some held their phones, recording the unfolding scene. The officer, perhaps emboldened by the growing attention, doubled down, his questions turning pointed, his tone increasingly condescending. "What's the real reason you're here? Traveling to meet someone, or just looking for trouble?" The pilot's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, knowing that how he handled this moment could define not only his day, but also the perception of those watching. Little did the security officer know, this wasn't just any passenger. This man's story was one of resilience, service, and a commitment to values that transcended uniforms and titles, and soon he would learn just how wrong he had been to judge someone by appearances alone. Stay tuned to discover how this confrontation took a turn no one expected, leaving the officer to confront the consequences of his actions in a way he never saw coming. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder as more passengers paused to see what was happening. The pilot stood tall, his eyes locked on the officer, but his expression betrayed nothing. It wasn't anger or frustration that people saw, it was control, the kind born from years of training to handle pressure in situations far more dangerous than this. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A quiet disappointment. The security officer leaned in, his voice dropping, but his words still audible to those standing nearby. "What are you hiding? A guy like you, walking around dressed like that, seems suspicious. A guy like you." The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. The pilot took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he faced prejudice. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at his skin before they saw his uniform. But no matter how many times it happened, it never stopped stinging. As the officer continued his line of questioning, the pilot's mind flickered back to the path that had brought him here. He thought about the years of hard work and dedication it had taken to earn the rank of captain in the United States Air Force. The countless hours of training, the missions that had taken him far from home, and the sacrifices he had made. He thought about his family, his mother, who had always told him to stand tall, no matter what the world threw at him. His father, a retired firefighter who had taught him the value of service and honor, and his younger sister, who had looked up to him her whole life, believing he was unstoppable. They were the reason he kept going, even when the road was hard. The officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "You didn't answer my question. Where are you headed?" "Back to my base," the pilot said simply, his tone calm but firm. "And why the rush? Got something to hide?" The pilot's lips tightened into a thin line. You could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the silent judgment of strangers who didn't know his story. Behind the growing crowd, a woman with a toddler shifted uncomfortably. An elderly man leaned on his cane, shaking his head. A young man with a backpack whispered to his friend, "Why is he giving him such a hard time?" The security officer seemed to thrive on the attention. He smirked, glancing around at the onlookers as if he were performing for an audience. But then his gaze fell back on the pilot, and his expression hardened. "You're awfully quiet for someone with nothing to hide," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The pilot straightened his shoulders. "I've answered your questions. Are we done here?" The officer's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Not so fast. I think we need to take a closer look at your belongings." He gestured to another officer, who reluctantly approached with a portable scanner. As the pilot's bag was opened and searched, a folded piece of paper slipped out and landed on the counter. The officer snatched it up, unfolding it with an exaggerated flourish. His smirk returned as he glanced over the document. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up for everyone to see. The pilot's calm demeanor shifted ever so slightly. His jaw clenched as he recognized the paper. It was a personal letter from his commander, praising him for his leadership during a recent mission. The words were private, meant only for him, but now they were being waved around like evidence of a crime. "That's none of your business," the pilot said, his voice low but steady. "Oh, I think it is," the officer replied, his smirk growing. He scanned the letter quickly, his expression changing as he read the words. For a brief moment, he seemed uncertain, almost embarrassed, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Big shot Air Force, ha," he said, his tone mocking. "Well, this isn't your base, Captain. Around here, you follow my rules." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people looked away, as if pretending not to see would make the situation less uncomfortable. Others kept their phones trained on the scene, recording every word, every gesture. A young woman near the front of the crowd finally spoke up. "He's not doing anything wrong. Just let him go." The officer shot her a sharp look. "Stay out of it." But the woman's words seemed to embolden others. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "This is getting ridiculous. The man's clearly not a threat. Why are you harassing him?" The officer's face flushed. He glanced at the growing crowd, then back at the pilot. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snapped at the businessman. "No," the pilot said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The officer froze, caught off guard by the quiet power in the pilot's words. "I've spent my career protecting this country," the pilot continued, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "including people like you, who think they can abuse their authority without consequences. I've earned the right to walk through this airport without being treated like a criminal." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support growing louder. The officer looked around, realizing that the tide had turned against him, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. "You think you're better than me because of that uniform," he sneered. The pilot didn't flinch. "No, but I think you owe every person here the respect they deserve, regardless of what they're wearing." The officer's smirk faltered again. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice crackled over his radio. "Officer Daniels, report to the main security desk immediately." Daniels hesitated, clearly torn between obeying the order and maintaining his fragile sense of authority. Finally, he threw the pilot's belongings into the tray with a huff and stepped back. "You're free to go," he said, his tone bitter. The pilot gathered his things without a word. He didn't look back as he walked away, his posture as straight and unyielding as ever. But the story wasn't over. Far from it. The events of that day would ripple far beyond the terminal walls, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. And Officer Daniels would soon discover that actions, no matter how small, always have consequences. As the pilot walked away from the checkpoint, The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but his mind was anything but calm. He had endured moments like this before, subtle jabs, blatant insults, and the unspoken assumptions that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But this felt different. The scene replayed in his mind, each word and gesture etched into his memory. He made his way to the gate, finding a seat in a quiet corner. Passengers trickled in, their faces a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Some nodded at him in silent support, while others avoided eye contact altogether. He didn't need their pity, but he appreciated the solidarity of those who saw him for more than the color of his skin. In the distance, Officer Daniels lingered near the security checkpoint, his expression unreadable. He watched as the pilot disappeared into the crowd, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on him. The murmurs of passengers hadn't stopped, and he could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him. They weren't saying anything, but their silence spoke volumes. One of the younger officers finally approached him. "Daniels, was that really necessary?" Daniels bristled. "What do you mean?" The younger officer hesitated, glancing around before speaking again. The guy wasn't doing anything wrong. He's a pilot, an Air Force pilot. Maybe you went too far. Daniels waved him off, but the comment stuck. His actions had been driven by instinct, or was it something else? He'd spent years in his role, enforcing rules and ensuring security, but the line between vigilance and bias had blurred. Meanwhile, back at the gate, the pilot's phone buzzed. It was a text from his best friend, Marcus, who had been one of the few people he confided in about the challenges he faced. Marcus. Everything okay? You've been quiet today. The pilot stared at the message for a moment before replying. Pilot, just the usual. Ran into someone who thought the uniform didn't fit the man. Marcus's response came quickly. Marcus. You want me to make some calls? People need to know what's happening out there. The pilot hesitated. Part of him wanted to let it go, to focus on his duties and move forward. But another part of him, one that had grown louder over the years, knew that silence could be just as damaging as the actions themselves. Pilot, not yet. Let me handle it first. As he hit send, a voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay for his flight. The irony wasn't lost on him. Delays seemed to be the theme of the day. In another corner of the airport, a young woman who had recorded the entire incident uploaded the video to her social media. Within minutes, it started gaining traction. Comments poured in, some expressing outrage, others defending the officer. The hashtags #AirportIncident and #AirForcePilot began trending, and the story quickly gained a life of its own. One comment read, "Imagine treating a man who serves our country like this. Disgraceful." Another countered, "The officer was just doing his job. Everyone gets checked at airports." The debate unfolded online, fueled by perspectives from people who had witnessed the incident firsthand and others who only saw a fragment of the story. Back at the main security desk, Daniels was called into the supervisor's office. The room was small and windowless, the air thick with unspoken tension. His supervisor, a woman with years of experience and a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured for him to sit. "Daniels," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I've received multiple complaints about your conduct today. Care to explain?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "I was following protocol." "Protocol," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "All personal bias." The question hit harder than he expected. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. "I've seen the footage," the supervisor continued. "It's making the rounds online as we speak. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about how we, as a team, are perceived." Daniels leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always considered himself a professional, someone who took his job seriously. But in this moment, he couldn't ignore the possibility that his actions had been influenced by something deeper, something he wasn't ready to confront. Elsewhere in the airport, a small group of passengers who had witnessed the confrontation approached the pilot. A man in his 40s spoke first. "Excuse me, Captain," he said, his tone respectful. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through back there. It wasn't right." The pilot looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you," he replied. "It means a lot." The man nodded. "My son's in the military, Navy, actually. I know how much you all sacrifice, and to see something like that happen to you." He trailed off, shaking his head. Another woman stepped forward. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "I'm sharing it because people need to see what's happening. Maybe it'll make a difference." The pilot offered a small smile. "I appreciate that. But more than anything, I hope it sparks a conversation. Change doesn't happen unless we're willing to talk about the hard stuff." The passengers nodded, their shared sense of purpose giving them a moment of connection in the chaos of the day. As the pilot boarded his delayed flight, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The confrontation at the checkpoint had been a small moment, but its impact was growing. Conversations were starting, at the airport, online, and within himself. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered, what would it take for things to truly change? As the plane ascended into the skies, the pilot sat by the window, staring at the endless horizon. The hum of the engines was a familiar comfort, but his thoughts remained restless. His hands rested on his knees, steady yet tense, as if bracing for something he couldn't quite define. The events at the airport replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't shut off. Each word, each glance, each moment of humiliation weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the blatant disrespect or the realization that it wasn't the first time he'd encountered it. He had trained himself to rise above moments like these, to lean on the values instilled in him by his family and his service. But today felt different. Today, the quiet restraint that had carried him so far felt more like a burden than a shield. In the rows behind him, passengers whispered about what had happened. Some scrolled through their phones, discovering the viral video that had now reached thousands of viewers. Comments continued to pour in, ranging from outrage at the treatment he had endured to debates about systemic issues that went far beyond a single interaction. At the airport, the ripple effects of the incident were growing. The airport's management team had been alerted to the video, and questions were being asked. Officer Daniels, now back on duty, felt the weight of every passing glance from his colleagues. The smug confidence he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a growing unease. "Daniels," the younger officer said quietly as they stood near the checkpoint, "it's not just about you anymore. People are watching. This is bigger than any of us." Daniels didn't respond, but the truth of those words was sinking in. He had spent years enforcing rules, believing he was doing his job well. But now, the cracks in his own judgment were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the pilot's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was another message from Marcus. Asterisk, asterisk, Marcus. Asterisk, asterisk. The video's everywhere now. People are talking. You okay? The pilot hesitated before replying. Asterisk, asterisk, pilot, asterisk, asterisk, I'm fine. Just tired of this cycle. Asterisk, asterisk, Marcus. Asterisk, asterisk, you're not alone in this. Let me know if you want me to step in. The pilot stared at the words for a long moment before typing back. Asterisk, asterisk, pilot, asterisk, asterisk, not yet. Let's see where this goes. As the flight continued, he reflected on Marcus's words. He wasn't alone, not this time. Strangers had stood up for him, spoken out when they could have stayed silent. And the growing momentum online suggested that the incident had struck a chord with people far beyond the airport. But even with that support, there was a part of him that felt isolated. He knew that this fight was far from over, and the weight of carrying it forward was heavy. At the same time, back at the airport, a senior member of the security team was reviewing the footage of the incident. The supervisor who had confronted Daniels earlier stood nearby, her arms crossed. "This doesn't look good," the senior member said, his tone grim. We need to get ahead of this before it escalates further. The supervisor nodded. Agreed, but it's not just about damage control. We need to address the root of the problem. This isn't the first time we've had complaints like this, and it won't be the last unless we make real changes. The senior member sighed, rubbing his temples. You're right, start with Daniels. He needs to understand the impact of his actions, on the passengers, on his team, and on himself. As they spoke, a notification popped up on the supervisor's phone. It was another video, this time from a passenger who had witnessed the aftermath of the incident. The video showed the pilot speaking with a small group of passengers, thanking them for their support. His calm demeanor and thoughtful words stood in stark contrast to the hostility he had faced earlier. The supervisor watched the video in silence, then handed the phone to the senior member. This is the kind of person we should be protecting, she said quietly, not tearing down. Meanwhile, on the plane, the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. He wasn't looking for revenge. He had seen enough of the world to know that anger alone wouldn't solve anything. But he also knew that ignoring the problem wouldn't make it go away. The captain of the flight made an announcement, breaking his train of thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. The pilot leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to face it, whatever it was. At the same time, back at the airport, the senior member of the security team approached Daniels, pulling him aside for a private conversation. Daniels, he began, his tone firm but not unkind, we need to talk about what happened earlier. Daniels looked away, his jaw tightening. I was just doing my job. Were you? The senior member asked, his voice steady. Or were you letting something else cloud your judgment? The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Daniels didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. The tension, now stretched to its breaking point, was everywhere, in the air, on the plane, and in the airport. Everyone involved knew that the story was far from over. And as the world watched, waiting for what would happen next, one thing became clear. This was a moment that could not, and would not, be ignored. As the plane touched down, the pilot felt a familiar jolt, both physical and emotional. The landing always brought a sense of closure to a flight, but today it felt like the opening of a new chapter. He gathered his things, nodding politely at a few passengers who gave him small gestures of solidarity as they disembarked. Outside the terminal, the cold air greeted him, sharp and refreshing. He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the chill, but his mind was still restless. Unknown to him, the video had gained more traction than he realized. Major news outlets were picking up the story, framing it as a stark example of bias in everyday interactions. The narrative was no longer just about an individual incident. It was becoming a broader discussion about respect, authority, and the assumptions people make about each other. But there was another twist brewing. Back at the airport where it all began, Officer Daniels was in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His meeting with the senior team had shaken him. They had made it clear that his actions were under review, and the consequences could be severe. For the first time, Daniels began questioning not just what he had done, but why he had done it. He had always prided himself on being vigilant, on following protocol to the letter. But now he couldn't ignore the voices in his head whispering that perhaps this was more personal than procedural. As he started his car, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. At first, he ignored it, but the buzzing continued, relentless and insistent. He finally picked it up, seeing a message from an unknown number. The text was brief but unsettling. You're on the wrong side of history. Do better. Daniels' stomach sank. He had heard about people receiving backlash online, but now it was his reality. He wondered how his personal number had been found, and whether this was just the beginning of something much larger. Meanwhile, the pilot checked into his hotel and found his phone lighting up with missed calls and messages. Marcus had left him several voicemails, his tone growing more urgent with each one. "Man, you need to call me back. This thing's blowing up. Reporters are asking questions. People are digging into everything. I think they even found Daniels' old records. There's stuff you need to see." The pilot sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, scrolling through social media. The hashtags had evolved. Now, alongside hashtag airport incident and hashtag Air Force pilot, there was a new one, hashtag Justice Fourth pilot. He clicked on it, and what he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't just his story anymore. People were sharing their own experiences, moments of humiliation, disrespect, and unjust treatment in airports, workplaces, and daily life. The pilot's story had become a catalyst for something much larger than he had anticipated. While part of him felt pride that his experience was helping to spark change, another part of him felt a deep unease. The momentum was out of his control now, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. Back at the airport, Daniels returned home and sat in his living room, the television on but muted. His phone buzzed again, another message from an unknown number. This one was different. "You've been given an opportunity to reflect. Don't waste it." Daniels frowned, confused. The message felt less like a threat and more like a challenge. He thought back to his own career, to the moments when he felt judged unfairly or overlooked. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. It was his first week on the job, and a senior officer had pulled him aside, criticizing him harshly in front of others. "You'll never be more than a rookie," the man had sneered. At the time, Daniels had vowed to prove him wrong, to rise through the ranks and earn respect. But somewhere along the way, he had hardened, and now he wondered if that hardness had blinded him. The pilot's phone rang again, and this time he answered. It was Marcus. "Hey," the pilot said, his voice weary. Finally, Marcus replied, exhaling sharply. "Listen, this thing's getting big. Too big to ignore. People are digging into Daniels' background. Apparently, he's had complaints before. And get this, someone found out he applied to the Air Force years ago and didn't get in." The pilot froze. "What?" "Yeah," Marcus continued. "He didn't make it past the first round. Some are saying that's why he might have targeted you." The pilot was silent for a long moment, processing the revelation. If true, it added a layer of complexity to the encounter, one that made it harder to simply write Daniels off as a bigot or dismiss his actions as a one-time mistake. "So what do I do?" the pilot finally asked. "Be strategic," Marcus said. "You have a platform now, whether you like it or not. Use it wisely. But don't let this get ugly. People are watching, and they'll follow your lead." The pilot nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "Thanks, man. I'll figure it out." As he hung up, his thoughts returned to Daniels. For the first time, he wondered what the officer's story was, what had shaped him, what had driven him to act the way he had. And as much as the pilot wanted accountability, he also wanted understanding. Across town, Daniels stared at his phone, his reflection visible in the dark screen. The messages from strangers, the conversations with his superiors, and his own doubts all swirled in his mind. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go on pretending nothing had happened. The stage was set, the stakes higher than ever. The pilot and Daniels were on a collision course, their lives intertwined by a single moment that neither of them could undo. Both men knew that the next steps they took would define not just this chapter of their lives, but how they would be remembered. The tension built, unresolved, as the world watched and waited for what would come next. The pilot sat quietly in a small conference room, his uniform pressed and his demeanor composed. Across from him sat a representative from the airport authority and a public relations officer, both looking slightly uneasy. They had requested this meeting after the video had gained international attention, seeking to address the issue before it spiraled further. Cameras and microphones were set up to record what they had framed as a public statement of accountability and reconciliation. The pilot had agreed, not for their benefit, but because he believed in addressing things directly. As the cameras rolled, the representative began with a carefully prepared statement, acknowledging the incident and promising to take measures to ensure such behavior would not happen again. But the pilot could see the discomfort in her eyes. This wasn't just about him. It was about the mounting pressure from the public. When it was his turn to speak, the pilot took a deep breath. "I want to thank those who stood up for me that day, both in person and online. This isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about how we treat each other and how we hold ourselves accountable to the values we claim to represent." He paused, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want this to be about revenge or retribution. It's about reflection and change. If we're not willing to look at ourselves honestly, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes." As his words resonated through the room, there was a sudden movement near the door. To everyone's surprise, Officer Daniels entered, his face pale but determined. Whispers rippled through the room as he stepped forward, his uniform crisp, but his posture uncharacteristically humble. "I asked to be here," Daniels began, his voice low but clear. "I needed to be here." The tension in the room was palpable. The pilot turned to face Daniels, his expression unreadable. "I had time to think about what happened," Daniels continued, "and I realized that what I did was wrong. Not just because it went viral, not just because people called me out, but because I failed to see you as a person, as someone who's given their life to serving this country. I let my biases and my own frustrations get in the way of doing my job the right way." Daniels swallowed hard, his voice shaking slightly. "I can't take back what I did, but I can take responsibility for it. And I'm sorry." The room was silent, the weight of Daniels' words hanging heavily in the air. The pilot studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said quietly. "But the real test is what you do after." The unexpected twist came as the meeting concluded. The airport authority announced a new initiative, spearheaded by both the pilot and Daniels, to address systemic issues within airport security and foster better understanding between staff and passengers. It was a surprising partnership, two men who had clashed so intensely now working together for change. Later that evening, as the pilot walked back to his hotel, his phone buzzed with another message from Marcus. Marcus. Saw the live stream. "You handled that like a pro. Proud of you." The pilot smiled faintly, replying simply, "Thanks." Meanwhile, Daniels returned home, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. For the first time in years, he felt like he had taken a step toward being the person he had always wanted to be. But he also knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. As the story faded from the headlines, it left behind a legacy of growth and understanding. The pilot and Daniels have faced their own truths, and in doing so, they had sparked a larger conversation about respect, accountability, and the power of redemption. The final twist was that what began as a moment of conflict had turned into a catalyst for change, proving that even the most difficult encounters can lead to something meaningful when approached with honesty and a willingness to grow. The weeks following the public reconciliation brought a sense of quiet resolution, though not without challenges. The pilot returned to his duties, flying missions and transporting personnel with the same dedication he had always shown. Yet, the incident lingered in his mind, not as a wound but as a lesson. It had shown him the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity and the power of addressing injustice with both courage and grace. The airport also felt the ripple effects of the incident. The new initiative launched by the pilot and Daniels gained traction, not only within the airport, but also as a model for other transportation hubs across the country. The program, focused on training security staff to recognize and address implicit biases, incorporated real-life stories and scenarios to drive home the importance of empathy and professionalism. The pilot even appeared in a few of the training videos, sharing his experience and emphasizing the need for mutual respect. Daniels, for his part, became a key figure in the initiative. At first, his involvement was met with skepticism from some of his colleagues, who questioned whether his actions stemmed from genuine remorse or public pressure. But over time, Daniels proved his commitment. He participated in every training session, openly sharing his story and encouraging others to reflect on their own actions and attitudes. One day, after a particularly impactful session, a younger officer approached Daniels. "I didn't think you'd actually own up to everything," she admitted, "but seeing you talk about it, it made me think about how I've handled situations too. Thanks for that." Daniels nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "We're all learning," he replied. "The important thing is that we don't stop." Meanwhile, the pilot received a steady stream of messages from people who had been inspired by his story. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others thanked him for handling the situation with dignity. Though he appreciated the support, he often redirected the praise to the larger movement that had emerged. "This isn't about me," he wrote in one response. "It's about all of us. Every time we choose to speak up, to listen, and to learn, we're making a difference." Months passed, and life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a public ordeal. The pilot and Daniels kept in occasional contact, their interactions respectful but not overly familiar. They both understood that their paths had crossed in a way neither could have anticipated, and though their lives were moving in different directions, the connection they had forged remained. One day, as the pilot prepared for another flight, he received an unexpected call from Daniels. "I just wanted to say thanks," Daniels said, his voice hesitant but sincere, "for giving me a chance to make things right. I didn't deserve it, but you gave it anyway." The pilot paused, surprised but touched. "It wasn't just about you," he said. "It was about all the people watching, all the people who needed to see that change is possible, but I appreciate the call." They spoke for a few more minutes, the conversation simple and unforced. When they hung up, the pilot felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The pilot's story gradually faded from the public spotlight, but its impact endured. Policies were updated, training programs expanded, and countless individuals began to approach their roles with a renewed sense of purpose. For many, the incident became a reminder of how a single moment could spark a much-needed conversation. For the pilot, the experience left him with a deeper appreciation for the power of resilience and the importance of accountability. As he soared through the skies on his next mission, he felt a sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges to face, but he knew that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for others who had faced similar struggles. As for Daniels, his journey was far from over, but he was determined to continue growing. He no longer saw his role as just a job. It was an opportunity to serve with integrity and to help others see the humanity in everyone they encountered. And so, the story came to a quiet but meaningful conclusion. It wasn't about a hero or a villain, but about two men who, in their own ways, found the courage to confront their flaws and work towards something better. It was a story of redemption, of understanding, and of the unexpected ways people can change. In the end, the lesson was clear. When we choose to see each other as individuals, when we listen and learn, we open the door to progress. And in those moments, no matter how small, we find the strength to rise above.